Marcus Draper had seen enough in his 25 years on the force to know that peace wasn't something you stumbled upon. It was something you built, piece by piece, often at the expense of your sleep, relationships, and, eventually, parts of yourself. After rising through the ranks of the city's police department and spending the last decade as deputy chief of operations, he wasn't a stranger to conflict. He'd dealt with organized crime, internal affairs pressure, political meddling, and the slow, daily erosion of public trust. But nothing had prepared him for what he hoped would be a simpler chapter of his life, moving into a quiet neighborhood in the suburbs, away from the chaos of his past posts, where he could finally decompress, keep his head down, and maybe enjoy what was left of the life he hadn't yet lived. The house was modest by most standards, but a personal milestone for Marcus. A craftsman-style build with a wide front porch, double garage, and a backyard just large enough to host a decent gathering. It wasn't luxury, but it was his, bought outright after years of saving and avoiding debt like the plague. The street it stood on wound through a well-manicured residential development lined with white fences, muted shutters, and those almost unsettlingly identical mailboxes. He hadn't picked it for the scenery. He picked it because the neighborhood claimed to be calm, neighborly, and safe. A few too many pamphlets at open houses had promised community, and Marcus, despite his better instincts, had started to believe maybe that wasn't such a stretch. His transfer to the precinct nearby was smooth, largely ceremonial. Everyone knew who he was before he arrived. His name carried weight, his reputation for no-nonsense leadership, methodical handling of departmental politics, and an unflinching record on discipline meant that people gave him space. But Marcus didn't want space anymore. He wanted presence. He wanted something that felt like life again. He hadn't thrown a party in years, not since the divorce, not since his daughter had left for college, not since his brother's funeral. But this move, this house, it marked something that felt like a hard-earned reset. And so he planned a housewarming. Not a fancy soiree, not a full-scale event. Just a barbecue. Simple. Real. For the department. For the few colleagues who had stood by him in the trenches. And maybe, though he wouldn't say it out loud, for himself. To remind himself he still belonged somewhere. He sent the invitations out as texts and phone calls, bypassing email entirely. This wasn't official business. This was for the people he trusted, the ones who hadn't buckled under pressure, the ones who never asked him to explain why he took a demotion to be closer to peace. By the end of the week, the guest list sat at 22. Officers, detectives, 2 forensic analysts, and 1 dispatcher who everyone loved more than coffee on Monday mornings. Their families were welcome, and Marcus had already ordered a load of ribs, chicken thighs, and enough beer and lemonade to drown out complaints about the late summer heat. He cleaned the deck, borrowed extra chairs from his neighbor across the street, an older man named Daniel who rarely spoke but nodded with a kind of veteran's understanding, and even repaired the motion sensor lights along the fence just in case kids wandered off after dark. Saturday came fast. The day bloomed with a cloudless sky, the kind that begged for slow-cooked meat and ice-cold drinks. By noon, folding tables were dressed with plastic covers, condiments lined up like soldiers, and the smoker out back was already huffing gentle white plumes into the air. Marcus, dressed in a charcoal-gray t-shirt and jeans that finally felt loose again after 2 months of stress-induced weight loss, moved through his own backyard like a commander prepping for a peaceful campaign. The playlist was classic R&B, subtle and unintrusive. Nothing too loud. No one needed flashbacks or noise complaints. He wasn't naive about the social dynamics of suburban neighborhoods. He knew eyes would be watching. He just hoped for decency. The first guests arrived around 1. Laughter came easy, the kind that only old friends and worn-out warriors could share. Hands were slapped, jokes were recycled, stories from precinct days were told with new exaggeration. A few kids kicked a soccer ball into the flower bed, and Marcus didn't even flinch. The air smelled like hickory, tangy sauce, sunscreen, and something that came dangerously close to contentment. For the first time in a long while, he felt off-duty in the truest sense. No one was checking their radios. No one mentioned cases. Even his own phone was face down inside the house, untouched. Then, just after 3 p.m., as he flipped a tray of sausages and sipped from a sweating can of beer, he noticed her. The woman. She was standing at the edge of the driveway, arms crossed, her mouth fixed in a scowl so tight it looked painful. Marcus didn't recognize her. Middle-aged, heavy-set, with a stiff posture and a brimmed hat pulled low like she was afraid of getting sunburned or perhaps recognition. Her floral top fluttered slightly in the breeze, but her expression stayed immovable, like something carved from salt. She wasn't part of the gathering. She hadn't even been on the sidewalk 10 minutes ago. She'd appeared like bad weather. Marcus wiped his hands and walked toward her, calm but direct. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked, his tone neutral, neither friendly nor defensive. She didn't introduce herself, didn't smile. Instead, she pulled a phone from her purse and started recording. "You don't have a permit for this," she snapped. "This is a residential street. That's a fire hazard. There are over 20 cars parked, blocking access. There are children here. I don't know who you think you are, but this is unacceptable." Marcus stood still. He'd heard this voice before, not hers specifically, but the tone. It was the voice of someone who didn't ask, only accused, who didn't de-escalate, only documented. "This is my house," he said plainly. "These are my colleagues. I'm not breaking any laws. Noise ordinance says we're well within limits. I saw open containers in a private residence. There are officers here? Yes, including the on-call fire inspector." Her face twitched. She didn't like that. It wasn't the answer she wanted. She stepped back, thrust her phone forward again, and said the words Marcus knew would come. "I'm calling 911. There's a large, unauthorized gathering. Possible intoxication, suspicious activity. It looks like some kind of paramilitary group. No uniforms, but armed men. They're using communication devices. This needs to be handled immediately." He stared at her, not in anger, not even disbelief, just a tired kind of recognition. It wasn't the first time he'd seen someone call for backup, not because there was a threat, but because they'd lost control of the narrative. And it wasn't the first time he'd watched the system weaponized by people who never truly had to fear it. But something about the moment still pulled at him. Not rage, just exhaustion. She didn't know who she was calling. She didn't know the men and women behind him had already responded to worse calls that morning. That some of them had buried partners and others still flinched at sudden noises. She didn't know this wasn't a paramilitary gathering. It was their one afternoon to breathe. He didn't argue. He didn't try to stop her. He simply stepped aside and let her report what she wanted. When she was done, she stared at him like he was supposed to panic. Instead, he just said, "You're welcome to a plate if you change your mind." And then he turned and walked back to the grill, the sizzle of meat drowning out her huffs, her phone still raised, her voice already losing power against the tide of calm she couldn't control. The rest of the barbecue carried on with an almost surreal sense of normalcy. After Karen, the name no one had asked for but all instinctively knew, finished her call and stormed back across the street, her phone still clutched like a badge of imagined authority. There was a moment of tension that hung like smoke in the summer air. Marcus hadn't said much after that. He simply went back to the grill, focused on the searing meat, and let the conversation pick back up around him as if nothing had happened. But something had, and everyone who had served long enough to know how these things unfold could feel it. A quiet shift, like the pressure drop before a storm. The call, as expected, didn't go unanswered. 20 minutes later, 2 patrol cruisers pulled up on the opposite curb, lights off, doors opening slowly. The officers who stepped out, uniformed, alert, and clearly unsure of what they'd been sent into, took one glance at the gathering and immediately relaxed their postures. One of them, Officer Denning, had trained under Marcus when he was a rookie. His eyes met Marcus's across the driveway, and he gave a small half-smile of recognition, though his tone remained formal as he approached. "Deputy Draper, got a call about a possible unauthorized gathering. Neighbor said there were concerns about open containers and paramilitary activity?" A few heads turned, chuckles slipped out under breaths, and Marcus let a dry smile touch his face. "Afraid we're just grilling meat and swapping war stories, Denning. Departmental tradition. I can show you the guest list, if you're interested." Denning shook his head slightly, pulling out his notepad more out of routine than necessity. "No need. I think we're all clear here, but for the record, we'll need to file something. Just a procedural log entry. Unfounded complaint." The other officer, a younger man who looked like he was only a year out of academy, hovered awkwardly behind him, unsure whether to laugh or be concerned. Karen, meanwhile, had reappeared across the street. She stood on her porch with arms folded, a phone still pressed to her ear, pretending to be occupied but very obviously watching every move, as if expecting some dramatic reveal. When the officers didn't haul anyone away or start questioning guests, her posture stiffened, and she vanished back behind her door, slamming it louder than necessary. The BBQ continued, but the mood had changed. No one said it aloud, but the easygoing atmosphere gave way to a low thrum of wariness. Marcus knew it wasn't about the threat. No one was afraid of Karen. But they were cautious because they understood how even a baseless accusation could spiral into something more if ignored. The group began to thin out earlier than planned. By dusk, only a few close friends remained. Marcus didn't blame anyone. He understood the calculus. Keep a low profile. Don't get dragged into another neighbor's delusions, and above all, don't become a headline. The next morning, Marcus rose early. He was a morning person by nature. Too many years of shift rotations had wired his body that way. Coffee in hand, he stepped out onto his porch and immediately noticed something unusual. Taped to his mailbox was a letter, folded neatly in an envelope with no return address, but his name printed in a blocky, almost childish scrawl. Inside, typed in formal font on a single sheet of paper, was a notice of community violation. The document accused him of hosting an unapproved large-scale gathering, operating without a noise mitigation plan, obstructing access to public right-of-way, and storing open waste in public view. It cited several ordinance numbers and concluded with a formal warning. Further violations could result in fines, legal action, or referral to the city zoning committee. Marcus read the letter twice. It wasn't on official county letterhead, but it mimicked it closely enough that a casual reader might believe it was legitimate. The language was bureaucratic, the accusations vague but plausible, and the implication clear. This wasn't over. What irritated Marcus most wasn't the content. It was the strategy. Someone had gone to the trouble of drafting a document designed to intimidate, confuse, and provoke. It wasn't from a governing body. It wasn't enforceable. But it was calculated. A nudge. A test. See how far she could push. See if he'd respond. He didn't. Not yet. Instead, he called a contact in city records and requested a review of any official complaints tied to his address in the last 48 hours. The clerk on the other end was helpful but confused. There were no records on file. No noise complaints, no emergency reports logged under his property. The 911 call had been filed, yes, but as non-actionable. The visit by the patrol unit had been tagged as civil dispute, no further action needed, which meant this letter wasn't just unauthorized, it was fabricated. Still, Marcus chose not to escalate. Instead, he documented everything, photographed the envelope, filed a time-stamped copy of the contents, and stored it in a folder he labeled Interactions Housewarming Week. It wasn't paranoia, it was habit. Over the next 3 days, the quiet tension deepened. Small things began to shift. A city landscaping truck showed up unannounced and claimed to be conducting a vegetation inspection along the sidewalk in front of his home. They trimmed aggressively and left branches in the street, then issued a caution for yard debris left unattended. The waste disposal service missed his pickup for the first time in over a year, and when he called to inquire, they said his address had been listed as under review for service suspension due to persistent container violations. Each time, Marcus calmly resolved the issue, but the pattern was forming. Small strategic inconveniences. Nothing large enough to report, everything deniable, but everything pointed in the same direction. The real moment came on Thursday afternoon. Marcus returned from the station to find a city code compliance officer standing in his driveway, clipboard in hand. The man, mid-40s, sweat-darkened collar, and the bored look of someone who dealt with nonsense daily, explained that an anonymous report had been submitted claiming that Marcus had installed surveillance devices without community consent, that he had erected structures not visible on the zoning plan, and that his property was hosting semi-professional gatherings that posed a nuisance risk to surrounding residents. Marcus calmly asked to see the report. The officer hesitated, then showed him a printed complaint. All items were vague, no names listed, just a string of accusations written in a tone of manufactured concern. He didn't argue. He invited the man to walk the perimeter, showed the yard, the fence, the smoker, even the inside of the shed. The officer, to his credit, took notes without judgment, finally closing the clipboard and muttering, "Looks fine to me. Honestly, this happens more than you'd believe." When Marcus asked if he dealt with the woman across the street often, the officer just sighed. "She files a lot of concerns, usually about new people. You're not the first." It wasn't comforting, but it wasn't surprising either. That evening, Marcus sat at his kitchen table reviewing the events of the week, sipping from a glass of water that felt colder than usual. He didn't speak to anyone about it, not yet. No texts to the department, no complaints to the city. He didn't want to look like he was retaliating. That was the trick of people like Karen. They thrived on escalation. They baited, provoked, and waited for the backlash to prove they were right all along. He wasn't going to play that game, but he wasn't going to sit quietly either. He opened a document on his laptop, titled it simply Sequence, and began logging each incident in chronological order. He included times, dates, names, and any relevant materials, photographs, recordings, city contacts. It wasn't a report. It wasn't for anyone else. It was insurance. It was foresight. He knew where this was headed, even if the neighborhood didn't. It started with a false call. Then came the paper threats. Then the bureaucratic intrusions. And sooner or later, someone would try to make it real. But Marcus Draper had built his life on being 10 steps ahead of trouble, and he had no intention of letting Karen Livingston become the one who caught him off guard. Marcus had never subscribed to the romantic notion that home was sacred, at least not in the sentimental way people often spoke of it. For him, a home was a point of defense, a perimeter, a place to hold ground against whatever chaos waited beyond its walls. In his years of law enforcement, he'd seen how fast comfort could evaporate when the wrong eyes turned toward you, how neighbors could become informants, and how a quiet street could become a staging ground for psychological warfare dressed in bureaucracy. He'd seen it from the outside, domestic disputes turned community-wide vendettas, disgruntled retirees weaponizing zoning laws, spiteful individuals pulling city resources into personal feuds. But now he wasn't watching it unfold for someone else. He was inside it. And the strange part was it didn't feel overtly hostile. It felt surgical, controlled, like whoever was pulling the strings knew exactly how to cause maximum disruption without setting off alarms. By the following week, things that once felt innocuous began to carry weight. Marcus noticed that his mail delivery had shifted from mid-morning to late afternoon. It was subtle, but consistent. Packages were delayed. One Amazon order was marked as "Address could not be verified." The post office claimed a temporary routing issue, but Marcus suspected otherwise. He didn't accuse. He didn't report. He simply adjusted, documented, and observed. He installed a discreet camera above his front door, not to catch vandals, but to monitor the rhythm of movement on the street. He wasn't expecting to record a crime. He was watching for patterns. 3 days later, he returned from a grocery run to find a small group of neighbors gathered across the street, just past Karen's yard, talking in tight circles with that too casual body language that always telegraphed discomfort. As he parked, one man, a balding father in cargo shorts and sandals, waved awkwardly but didn't approach. 2 others glanced in his direction and then looked away. He knew that dynamic too well. People caught between the facts and whatever version they'd already been told. The seed had been planted. Karen had likely spent her days on the phone, crafting a narrative piece by piece, tapping into that slow-drip method of suspicion. "I'm not saying he's dangerous, but I just think we should be careful." Or perhaps the more insidious, he's ex-law enforcement. Those types tend to be very private. You never really know what's going on in there. People didn't need proof. They needed the illusion of consistency. And Marcus, a solitary figure with a trimmed lawn, tinted windows, and a mostly closed-off demeanor, was ripe for assumption. Later that evening, as dusk settled into a golden haze, he took a walk around his property, checking the gate latches and inspecting the motion-activated lights he'd installed near the side entrance. Everything looked intact until he reached the back corner of the fence. A small section, no larger than a shoebox, had been scratched. Deep gouges into the wood, deliberate but poorly concealed. He crouched, ran his fingers across the cuts, and found what he expected. A tiny chip of black plastic embedded in the splintered edge. He recognized it instantly. Part of a cheap wildlife camera, the kind hunters mounted to trees, often motion-sensitive, designed to capture nocturnal activity. He didn't find the rest of the device, just the remnants. Someone had installed it perhaps days ago and then removed it in a hurry. The gouges suggested it had been yanked out without tools, maybe during daylight when someone got nervous about being spotted. He didn't call anyone. He didn't make a scene. Instead, he bagged the chip, logged the time and date, and made a quiet note in his file. No accusations, just facts. But something about that discovery shifted his approach. He'd spent years playing defense. Now it was time to change posture. The following morning he contacted a private investigator, not someone from the department, but a former analyst who now worked freelance for civil attorneys. Her name was Laurel Nash. She was sharp, quiet, and came highly recommended for her discretion. They met at a diner just outside city limits, where Marcus laid out the situation in broad terms. Neighborhood dispute, possible targeted harassment, pattern of low-grade disruption escalating in frequency and coordination. He didn't ask her to uncover a scandal. He asked her to map the network. Who was talking to whom? What complaints were filed? Where Karen got her information? Laurel didn't promise much, but she agreed to look into public filings, utility requests, surveillance habits common in the area, and any data trails left by neighborhood watch groups. While she worked, Marcus kept his routine. He went to work, kept his yard clean, waved to neighbors, and stayed visible. That was key. Not retreating. People like Karen expected silence. They needed it, in fact, because silence gave them space to fill in the blanks. He gave them nothing but stability. Polite, consistent, neutral. And yet, the pressure increased. One morning, he found a flyer wedged into his gate. It looked official at first, printed on glossy cardstock, clean font, a logo in the corner. It was an invitation to a community safety forum, scheduled for the coming weekend. The topic: Responding to authority in residential zones, rights, risks, and realities. The language was subtle but charged. The text raised questions about unmonitored law enforcement presence and the growing concern among residents regarding surveillance and control dynamics. It was clear who the target was. It didn't mention his name, but the implication was thick as tar. He attended the forum. Of course he did. He sat in the back, unassuming, in jeans and a windbreaker. The room was half full. 30 or so residents, mostly retirees, a few couples, and Karen at the front table, gesturing with calm outrage as she guided the conversation. There were no outright accusations, just suggestions. She spoke about residential overreach, blurring of personal and professional roles, and the importance of civic transparency. A few nodded, others looked uneasy. One woman voiced concern about kids playing near homes with unknown guests, and Karen leaned in saying, "We should all feel safe knowing who's around our children." Marcus said nothing. He didn't interrupt. He didn't raise his hand. But afterward, he approached a city liaison who'd been quietly observing from the side. They shook hands. Marcus introduced himself and asked a single question. Was this event registered through city outreach or organized independently? The liaison, a young woman with a badge labeled Community Engagement, looked startled, then admitted the flyer had been submitted without approval, using an old template from a city-sponsored seminar held years prior. The forum, in essence, was a fraud. He didn't take legal action. He didn't challenge Karen in public. Instead, he filed a quiet ethics complaint, citing misuse of municipal branding and misleading promotional materials. Within days, Karen received a formal letter from the city clerk's office requesting clarification on the event's organization and funding. She denied wrongdoing, of course, but word spread. People began to question her intentions, not loudly, not openly, but enough that Marcus noticed a shift. A few more neighbors waved. One brought over leftover muffins from a bake sale, claiming she had too many. The man who once waved awkwardly across the street now nodded with more warmth. But Karen didn't slow down. She doubled down. And the next escalation wasn't symbolic. 2 weeks after the BBQ, Marcus received a registered letter from a law firm representing a group of concerned residents. The letter stated that he had created a pattern of disturbance by hosting gatherings that disrupted the character of the neighborhood, citing visual, auditory, and vehicular strain. The complaint requested formal mediation to discuss limitations and boundaries for future use of his property, warning that continued inattention to community concerns could result in civil litigation under nuisance statutes. Marcus read the letter in silence, jaw tight. There were no signatures attached, just the firm's letterhead and a generic closing. He didn't respond immediately. He scanned the letter, forwarded it to his own attorney, and flagged the law firm for background research. 2 days later, his attorney called and confirmed what he'd suspected. The firm was small, mostly dealing in HOA disputes, with a reputation for sending boilerplate threats designed to pressure settlements or behavioral concessions without going to court. It was a tactic, a bluff, but it was designed to drain him, not financially, but emotionally. to make him second-guess his place in his own home. That night, as he sat on his back porch, the grill cold, the yard silent, and his drink untouched, Marcus allowed himself a rare moment of stillness. Not defeat, not fear, just clarity. He wasn't up against a person. He was up against a campaign. A system of whispers, paperwork, sideways glances, and petty legal tricks. And the only way to beat it wasn't with rage. It was with presence, resilience, documentation, calm. They wanted a reaction. But what they were going to get was something far more dangerous. A man who knew how to wait. Marcus had always believed that the most dangerous adversary wasn't the one who struck first. It was the one who waited, who gathered information, who built a case so slowly that by the time you felt the trap closing, it was already too late to wriggle free. That philosophy had guided most of his career, especially during his years in internal affairs, where the real battles were rarely fought in the open. They played out in shadows, in paperwork, in whispered conversations, and subtle changes to policy that, piece by piece, pulled a target under. And now, standing in the center of what was supposed to be the quietest chapter of his life, Marcus recognized that same strategy being used against him. It didn't scare him, but it forced him to adjust his pace. He had to stop playing defense. Laurel Nash, the private investigator he'd quietly hired 2 weeks earlier, called him on a Tuesday morning just as he was leaving the house. Her tone was clipped and direct, the way it always was when she had something worth saying. "We need to talk," she said without pleasantries. "You're not dealing with just one person anymore. You've got a system forming around her, whether she's smart enough to realize it or not." They agreed to meet later that evening at a park halfway between their respective zip codes, public, quiet, low risk. Marcus arrived early, parked under the shade of a jacaranda, and watched families on the walking trail, trying to imagine a version of life where his biggest problem was forgetting sunscreen. Laurel arrived on time, dressed in jeans and a windbreaker, holding a tablet with a cracked corner and a manila folder that looked too thin to be threatening. She got right to the point. "I ran data on all complaints tied to your property. 27 entries over the last 4 weeks. 10 of them are public, what you've already seen. The rest were submitted through anonymous tip lines, some using burner email addresses, others through old request forms pulled from municipal archives that technically aren't active anymore. That's the pattern I needed to confirm." She's pulling forms from city records that were never properly retired and submitting them as if they're still valid. Some of them get routed to current departments, others sit in limbo. But the goal's not enforcement. It's confusion, fatigue, drain your time and trust in the process. She opened the folder and laid out several pages, printouts of complaint forms, all marked with similar language. The formatting varied slightly, but the phrasing was repetitive. Possible code violations, concerned for neighborhood safety, residents feel increasingly uncomfortable. One stood out immediately. It was a typed letter, but someone had scribbled a note in the margin with a blue pen, a loopy, almost childlike script that read, "He watches people from the porch, like he's gathering intel." Marcus read that line twice and didn't say a word. It wasn't fear that settled in his chest. It was recognition. He had been profiled, not by his race, not by his badge, but by his demeanor. They didn't understand him, so they labeled him suspicious. Laurel continued. "This is where it gets interesting. There's a woman named Patricia Sloan. She lives 2 streets over, a retired city planner. You wouldn't know her name because she doesn't attend the same events as Karen, but 6 of the anonymous forms trace back to her IP. I found her through data cross-referencing, public Wi-Fi requests linked to document submission timestamps. She's not technically collaborating with Karen, but she's amplifying the signal. Every time Karen files something, Sloan submits a supporting concern within 48 hours. It gives weight to the complaint, makes it seem widespread. Marcus leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose. It wasn't just a neighbor feud anymore. It was an informal coalition. 2 women, possibly more, leveraging old civic tools to build a paper war. They weren't breaking laws. They weren't defaming him outright. But they were creating density. Filing, resubmitting, repeating. If the city ever opened a review, the sheer volume of concern might be enough to justify scrutiny, regardless of the truth. "So, what's the play?" he asked. Laurel didn't answer immediately. She tapped the screen of her tablet, then showed him a map marked with digital pins. "Here's the thing. Karen doesn't have the technical skill to do all this herself. She's using someone else's formatting. Every one of these PDFs was created using the same version of a city software license that was discontinued last year. That means she's either got someone on the inside feeding her documents, or she's getting them from an archive that wasn't secured properly. And here's where it gets worse. One of the forms she submitted includes an embedded metadata tag that points to a user login registered to a former city employee, someone who left under investigation 2 years ago for unauthorized access to property assessment systems." Marcus felt his stomach turn, not in panic but in a cold, calculating awareness. This wasn't amateur meddling. Someone had shown Karen how to manipulate a system, and she was doing it well enough to blur the line between concern and harassment. Laurel closed the folder. "My recommendation? You go quiet. Stop responding to complaints. Stop reporting the incidents. Let them build. I'll track the sources and timing. Once we have a confirmed pattern of collusion and document misuse, we go to the city ombudsman, not the department. Skip the politics. Go straight to the bureaucratic nerve center." Marcus nodded. It wasn't the answer most people would expect from a former law enforcement officer. They wanted action, confrontation, immediate justice. But he knew better. Real justice required endurance. It required patience, not performance. He thanked Laurel, handed her an envelope with her retainer bonus, and drove home in silence, mind racing but breath steady. That night, he turned off the lights in his living room and stood by the front window, watching the soft glow of Karen's porch light across the street. It flickered slightly, like a heartbeat. She was home, probably pacing, probably drafting her next complaint, waiting for a reaction that wouldn't come. And in that moment, Marcus didn't feel powerless. He felt anchored. The tide had shifted. She just didn't know it yet. He sat down at his desk and opened a new document. It wasn't a log, or a report, or a letter to any agency. It was a reflection, something he hadn't done in years. He wrote not about her, but about the neighborhood, about the quiet tyranny of fear disguised as community concern, about the way systems could be co-opted by people with too much time and too little empathy. He didn't plan to share it, but writing it grounded him. He wasn't the villain. He wasn't the threat. He was the wall she kept pushing against, hoping to find cracks, and he had no intention of breaking. The summer heat had begun to shift into that strange late-season humidity that made the evenings feel heavier than they should, like the air itself was reluctant to let go of something unseen. Marcus noticed the change not just in temperature, but in rhythm. The street felt quieter, not in the peaceful sense, but with a sort of simmering restraint, like the neighbors were watching more closely, speaking more softly, waiting for something to happen that no one would admit was already underway. He had been methodically logging every interaction, every note slipped under his door, every unscheduled inspection, and yet there was a point beyond which documentation stopped feeling like control and started to resemble a form of slow surrender. But he never stopped. The moment you stop tracking the attack is the moment the attack wins. And Marcus Draper didn't lose track. It was a Thursday when the first knock came. Too early to be a visitor, too soft to be official. He opened the door to find a plain manila envelope on the welcome mat. No return address, just his name printed in capital letters. Inside were 6 printed photos, color, grainy, clearly taken at a distance. The subjects were familiar: himself, his backyard, his grill, and in one frame a child sitting at the edge of the lawn eating from a paper plate, clearly one of the guest kids from the housewarming. The angles suggested they were shot from across the street, possibly from inside a vehicle. There was no note, no threat, but the message was unmistakable. "We're watching. Not just you. Everyone who stands with you." Marcus sat at his dining table and studied each image for details. Nothing illegal, nothing compromising, just invasive, deliberately unsettling, the kind of tactic used to rattle someone off center without ever saying a word. This wasn't about complaints anymore. This was a campaign of psychological pressure, one he knew all too well from years of sitting across the table from internal saboteurs, whistleblowers who turned vindictive, and citizens who believed their local cop was the final boss of their suburban video game. Still, he didn't call it in. He scanned the photos, logged their metadata, checked them for fingerprints. None. The prints were too clean, too dry, and clearly handled with gloves. It wasn't amateur work, but it also wasn't professional surveillance. It was a hybrid. Someone with access to tools, but no sense of subtlety. That weekend, a notice appeared on the community bulletin board, right at the edge of the local park. It was printed on heavy cardstock, laminated, and attached with 3 silver pushpins that seemed too polished for casual use. It read, "Neighborhood Concerns and Conduct Review. Open Forum. This Sunday, 4 p.m. Below the heading was a statement about recent developments that have disrupted the peace and cohesion of our community, calling on all concerned residents to participate in a discussion regarding ongoing property-related disturbances." No signature, but a small note at the bottom listed a private email for RSVP and a moderation committee. Marcus immediately recognized the email domain. It belonged to a shell community site registered 3 months ago, the same one Karen had used to post a warning about noise-generating installations and unmonitored foot traffic 2 streets over. This wasn't a city event. It wasn't even a sanctioned meeting. It was a trap, a public relations maneuver disguised as community outreach, designed to draw attention to Marcus's supposed infractions while pretending to foster dialogue. He didn't attend. He didn't send a representative. Instead, he watched from a distance, sitting in his vehicle parked a few blocks away with binoculars resting on the dash like a soldier on recon. The meeting attracted a dozen people at most. Older residents, 2 middle-aged couples, and Karen, who stood at the front like a reluctant martyr, answering questions in a calm, deliberate tone. Her body language was rehearsed, hands open, shoulders relaxed, but eyes scanning constantly, looking for any sign of opposition. At one point, she gestured across the street in Marcus's direction, likely spinning a tale about high-risk gatherings or patterns of defensive behavior. He didn't need to hear the words. He knew the cadence. Once you give fear a microphone, it sings whatever tune it pleases. The following day, an official letter arrived, not from Karen, not from her lawyer, but from the City Department of Public Safety. It informed Marcus that multiple anonymous reports had been filed regarding potential violations of conditional use permits for residential gatherings. The letter stated that due to cumulative concern, a preliminary review had been initiated to evaluate whether his property was being used in ways inconsistent with residential zoning. Marcus read the letter 3 times. It was masterfully worded, dry, bureaucratic, intentionally ambiguous. It didn't accuse him of a crime. It didn't demand an inspection. It simply informed him that a process had begun. A process he hadn't been invited to, couldn't appeal, and wouldn't see the outcome of until it either escalated into an order or evaporated from lack of evidence. That same evening, just as the sun dipped behind the roof lines and the streetlights began to flicker alive, Marcus noticed two teenage boys lingering near the end of his driveway. They weren't being aggressive. They weren't damaging anything. They were simply there, leaning against their bikes, talking in low tones, occasionally glancing toward his front porch. He stepped outside, arms crossed, and said nothing. After a moment, one of them called out, "Hey, you the guy with the cameras?" The question was delivered without malice, but with that specific curiosity teenagers use when they're trying to provoke a reaction. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Cameras?" he asked calmly. The kid shrugged. "My mom said you're always recording people, that you flagged our house in some kind of police system." It was a minor moment, a single sentence, but it landed like a freight train. Marcus nodded once, gave no further response, and stepped back inside. He didn't need confirmation. Karen wasn't just targeting him through institutions anymore. She was infecting the narrative itself, whispering into the ears of families, reframing his presence as something predatory, dangerous, unwanted. That night, Marcus logged into a secure terminal and reviewed his internal record. There were no flags, no watch lists tied to his address, no notes of concern. But the seed had already been planted. The lie was out. And the only thing more powerful than evidence in a community like this was a rumor wrapped in just enough truth to sound believable. The next escalation came not as a document or a whisper, but a visit. On Tuesday, Marcus returned home to find a police cruiser idling in front of his house. Different unit, different officers. One of them, a young sergeant named Patel, approached him with a tight smile and an apologetic tone. "Got a call about a possible domestic disturbance," he said, keeping his voice low. "Sounded like nonsense, but we had to check it out. Dispatch said it came from a restricted number, but the caller gave your name and address specifically." Marcus didn't react. He simply gestured to the house. "You're welcome to look around," he said. "But there's no one inside except me, and I haven't so much as raised my voice today." Patel declined, noting there were no sounds, no visible signs of distress. It was routine, but it wasn't nothing. Someone had just called the cops on him, fabricated an emergency, and tried to trigger a welfare check. It was a serious line to cross, and Marcus knew the implications. If it happened again, if a different officer responded, if he wasn't home to open the door, it could lead to a forced entry, a misunderstanding, an incident. He called Laurel that night, voice calm but edges tight. "We're not dealing with just harassment anymore," he said. "This is the kind of setup that turns into a headline." She agreed. They both understood what came next. It was time to push back, not with retaliation, but with exposure. Not with confrontation, but with strategy. Over the next week, they quietly compiled the full digital profile. Every fake complaint, every duplicated submission, every manipulation of city resources, all matched to metadata and IP logs that linked back to Karen's household and her known allies. Laurel worked with a third-party legal analyst to package the material into a concise, legally formatted dossier, then submitted it to the Office of the Inspector General with a copy to the City Ethics Committee. No fanfare. No press. Just a calm notification that a formal pattern of abuse of public systems had been uncovered, complete with evidence, timeline, and context. Then Marcus did something unexpected. He attended a neighborhood potluck. It was held 2 blocks away, hosted by a family who had remained mostly neutral during the recent tension. Marcus brought a tray of smoked ribs, shook hands, smiled politely, and never mentioned the conflict. He simply showed up, talked, ate, listened, laughed. And in that moment, without saying a word about the campaign against him, He reminded the neighborhood who he really was. Not a threat, not a spy, not a symbol of state overreach. Just a man with a home and a right to peace. Karen didn't attend the potluck, but Marcus knew she would hear about it. And that was the point. It had been nearly 2 months since the housewarming barbecue, and though the calendar said summer was fading, the heat hadn't let go. The air clung heavy to everything: clothes, skin, conversations. And Marcus knew instinctively that something was about to break. He'd felt it before, back in the city, usually before a scandal surfaced or a sting went sideways. There was a specific kind of tension that came not from action, but from the coiled silence that preceded it. Everything seemed still, but nothing was calm. The city had gone quiet in response to the complaint dossier. The Office of the Inspector General had acknowledged receipt and confirmed an internal review was underway, but they weren't in the business of updates. Their job was to move slowly, deliberately, without noise. Marcus understood that better than anyone. But Karen must have sensed the shift, too, because the moment her narrative began to slip out of her hands, she escalated in the only way someone like her could, by forcing a confrontation, publicly, and with full expectation that she'd walk away the victim. It started with a letter, not anonymous. This one was signed, printed on letterhead from a local legal advocacy group Marcus didn't recognize, filled with language about harassment, intimidation, and disproportionate presence of law enforcement influence in residential communities. The letter accused Marcus of targeting his neighbor with retaliatory surveillance, threatening conduct, and a campaign of psychological destabilization. It was laughable in its projection, but it wasn't funny. It was delivered not by mail, but by courier, handed to his receptionist at the precinct while Marcus was still at lunch. That was the point. Karen wanted his colleagues to see it, to question him, to begin wondering whether the rumors might hold a sliver of truth. But Marcus didn't give it the oxygen she hoped for. He read it once, logged it in the sequence file, and returned to his duties. If she wanted attention, she'd have to earn it the hard way. The following weekend, the attack came. Not in the form of paperwork or complaints, but through calculated spectacle. Marcus was returning from the grocery store, pulling into his driveway with a trunk full of dry goods and iced meat, when he saw her. Karen was standing in the center of her lawn, flanked by 2 men holding smartphones, both angled toward his home. In her hand was a tablet, and on the sidewalk was a laminated sign stuck into the grass that read, "Community Caution Zone. Subject under complaint review." It looked official, city-style formatting, sans serif font, the same kind of trick she'd used on the flyer weeks before, only now scaled to street-level propaganda. As Marcus stepped out of his car, she raised the tablet, pointed it toward him, and said, loud enough for her makeshift crew to hear, "That's him, the man who's been surveilling our block without consent. We're documenting his response for safety purposes." He didn't flinch. He didn't speak. He calmly lifted the groceries from the back seat, locked the car, and walked into his house without so much as a glance in her direction. Behind him, one of the men muttered something under his breath, and Karen laughed, a high, sharp sound with no real mirth in it. Inside, Marcus placed the bags on the counter and took a deep breath. He knew she was trying to provoke him. She wanted footage, a reaction, something to cut up, reframe, and weaponize. But silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy, and he wasn't playing defense anymore. By Monday, his attorney had sent a cease and desist letter to the legal advocacy group, citing defamation, misuse of municipal imagery, and targeted harassment. A copy was sent to the city's legal office and attached to the growing complaint package under review. That should have been the end of it. But of course, it wasn't. On Wednesday evening, just past 9 o'clock, Marcus received a text from a neighbor 3 houses down. A single photo, a group of people standing on Karen's lawn holding candles. A vigil. He stepped onto his porch and saw it for himself. Dozens of residents, many of whom he'd never spoken to, holding candles and printed signs with phrases like "Justice in our streets" and "Stop the intimidation." In the middle stood Karen, once again, narrating. This time reading from what appeared to be a prepared statement amplified by a small portable speaker. She called him by name, publicly, claimed she had been subjected to months of emotional aggression, of living under the shadow of unwarranted surveillance, and declared that no one, not even those with badges and friends in City Hall, should be above neighborhood accountability. Cameras flashed. A man in a sport coat recorded everything from across the street. Marcus didn't recognize him. Probably a blogger, maybe a local activist. He stood there for a moment, taking it in, not in anger, but in analysis. Then he closed his door and went back to work. Laurel called him the next morning, her voice sharp. "You've been publicly accused. The footage is already online. She wanted it viral. And it's picking up traction." He nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "We knew this was coming. She can't win through the system, so she's trying to win through spectacle. But it's sloppy." Laurel agreed. Sloppy and timed. "I checked the upload source. It hit social channels exactly 2 hours after a metadata review request was filed with the city clerk's office, one that included the contents of your full complaint file." That got his attention. So someone inside City Records leaked it. She didn't answer, which was answer enough, but what neither of them expected was what happened next. That afternoon, Marcus was called into a meeting, not with the precinct, but with city representatives. A formal inquiry had been launched, not into Karen's conduct, but into his. The accusations had been enough, paired with public optics, to force a temporary review of his off-duty conduct, particularly regarding the use of surveillance equipment and personal influence. He was placed on administrative leave, not disciplinary yet, but indefinite pending review. He was told to turn in his badge and service weapon. He did, without argument, without resistance, because he knew what came next. While the city stumbled through its process, he acted, quietly, precisely. Within 48 hours, Laurel submitted a full analysis to the Ombudsman's office. Every manipulated form, every anonymous complaint traced to the same node, every falsified notice or deceptive flyer, cataloged, time-stamped, verified. It included witness statements, IP logs, even screenshots of Karen's private group chats, which had been recovered legally through cross-reference requests from affiliated online platforms. The document was damning, but Marcus didn't release it to the public. He sent it straight to the Inspector General's office and copied the city manager's chief of staff. Then he waited. The tipping point arrived 3 days later, during a scheduled city council session. Public comment was open, and as expected, Karen was there, ready to speak. She took the podium with confidence, her voice carrying, her words crafted with practiced outrage. She laid out her claims in detail, painting herself as a citizen turned activist, speaking truth to power. And then something unexpected happened. The chairperson paused, shuffled through a folder, and said, "Before we move forward, we've received a preliminary report from the Inspector General's office regarding submitted complaints in this matter." There was a pause. Karen shifted, visibly thrown. The chair continued. "Based on evidence submitted by a third-party investigator, the city has determined that several documents attributed to anonymous citizens were submitted from a single household IP address. Additional findings suggest intentional misuse of municipal resources and misrepresentation of legal affiliations." Gasps scattered across the room. Karen froze. Someone stood in the back with a phone, already filming. But this wasn't her production. It was his. The council didn't make a ruling that day. But the narrative collapsed. The story flipped. And Marcus, still on leave, didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The facts were speaking now. 3 weeks had passed since the council meeting. The heat finally broke. Morning air was cooler now, the kind that made you step onto the porch and breathe a little deeper before your first sip of coffee. The street looked the same, but something had shifted beneath the surface. An invisible weight that had lifted, not completely, but just enough for the neighborhood to move again. Marcus noticed it in small ways. The mail arriving on time again, the garbage collectors waving instead of driving past, the kids returning to the sidewalks on bikes without glancing nervously at his house. People were no longer avoiding eye contact. They weren't apologizing either. But that was fine. Marcus didn't need apologies. He needed consistency. And for the first time in months, things were starting to feel still. The Inspector General's office hadn't released a formal public report. Those things never came quickly, but internal notices had circulated. The council had quietly amended its policy on public complaint forms, requiring validation before escalation. The legal advocacy group that had backed Karen distanced themselves without comment. City staff who had failed to detect or prevent the manipulation of municipal procedures were reassigned or reprimanded privately. Karen herself remained silent. Her laminated signs disappeared. Her porch light stayed off. Her car, once parked prominently near the curb, was now kept in the garage. Neighbors who had stood with her either retreated to silence or tried to return to the rhythms of social normalcy. But Marcus didn't forget who'd printed flyers, who'd held candles, who'd posted hashtags without understanding what they were attaching themselves to. He didn't hold a grudge, but he remembered. His leave officially ended the following Monday. No ceremony, no speeches. He walked into the precinct just before shift change, dropped his keys on the desk, nodded to the lieutenant on duty, and went straight to work. No one asked questions. Those who mattered had stayed in touch. Those who hadn't were now cautious in their tone, choosing words more carefully, not because they feared him, but because they finally saw him as something more complex than a uniform. Not a threat, not a watchdog, just a man with boundaries they hadn't expected to be so firm. Laurel called later that week. The case was closed. The metadata, the digital trail, even the vigil footage had all served their purpose. The Inspector General thanked her personally, off record, for maintaining professionalism and objectivity. Marcus offered her double her rate. She refused. "You handled it the right way," she said. "Most people don't." He didn't respond, just thanked her and hung up, standing for a moment by the window with the phone still in his hand. Outside, the street was quiet. The world had returned to routine. That weekend, without announcements or invitations, he rolled the smoker back onto the deck. No banners, no long guest list. Just a couple of colleagues, a few families from the department, and the neighbor across the street. Daniel, the quiet man with the tidy lawn and the silent loyalty. They ate slowly, talked about nothing serious. No mention of complaints or councils or city policy. Just food, laughter, and the kind of silence that meant comfort, not tension. Midway through the afternoon, as smoke curled into the sky and the sound of a child's toy car echoed down the driveway, Marcus looked up and saw something he didn't expect. Karen was standing at the edge of her property. No phone, no flyers, no tablet. She wasn't even trying to be noticed, just standing there, arms crossed, face blank, watching for a long moment before turning and walking back inside. It wasn't a confrontation. It wasn't a truce. It was just a glimpse of the truth. Maybe regret, maybe resentment, or maybe just the hollow silence of a campaign that had collapsed under its own weight. Marcus didn't wave, didn't call out. He simply turned back to the grill, flipped the ribs, and said nothing. Later, when the guests had gone and the sun was sinking behind the rooftops, Marcus sat alone on his porch, a cold drink in his hand and the faint hum of cicadas filling the air. The house behind him no longer felt like a battleground. It felt earned. Not through rage or victory, but through endurance. He didn't celebrate. He didn't post. He didn't need a moment of triumph. He had the quiet. And that was enough. In neighborhoods like this, peace wasn't given. It was defended, brick by brick, rule by rule, conversation by unspoken boundary, and Marcus Draper had defended his, calmly, lawfully, and without losing himself in the fire. That was the real win. Not headlines, not vindication, just the simple right to live without permission. And as the last light faded from the sky and the world outside exhaled into night, he stayed where he was, present, grounded, and still.